Years ago, I was a student nurse training in a small cottage hospital in my hometown. My student nurse uniform was gray, which is an important detail, as is the fact that I am a male nurse, not a female, and very obviously male too. So, as a student nurse, I was asked by my mentor at the time to go and inform a patient she was being discharged the next day. I approached said patient and informed her of the news.
Yes, I already know.
Oh,
Yes, that lady in the gray uniform told me.
I thought it odd, being as I was the only person in a gray uniform at the time, and being obviously male, I couldn't see her getting confused. But I didn't think about it too much as I had other stuff to do. I was then asked to tell a second patient something. I actually can't remember what it was. Something regarding upcoming treatment, and then I got a near identical response.
Yes, that other nurse already told me.
Which other nurse?
Oh, I don't know her name, but she wears gray like you.
At this point, I thought it odd enough that I went to my mentor and asked if another student was working on the ward. My mentor told me no. I asked if there was someone else wearing a gray uniform. At this point, my mentor and a caretaker both did a side glance at each other and asked why I was asking. I explained the situation. Both the nurse and the caretaker looked at each other knowingly and then looked at me. The caretaker looked visibly worried. I asked what was going on. My mentor, the nurse, told me there were stories on the ward about a lady in gray who would sometimes interact with patients, and that also the old uniform in the hospital used to be gray. The caretaker started telling me how every so often a patient comes out with a line about seeing or interacting with a nurse in gray. But the caretaker said she had never believed it until now. The fact I was a student from outside the hospital who had never heard the story, and the fact I had come asking about this lady in gray, freaked her out a bit. I got continuous questions from the caretaker for the rest of the shift.
Are you sure you have never heard of it? Are you sure you're not pulling my leg?
But genuinely, I had two separate patients tell me they had both received information from a nurse in gray that day. The two patients were in separate parts of the ward, so it's not like they were communicating and playing a prank. And all the staff wore blue, apart from the housekeepers, who wear burgundy. I'm a journalist and editor living in Turkey and interested in paranormal events, so I researched the ones here in Turkey. This event I share with you here is told to me by one of my readers who experienced it, and the story is shared with his consent. I'm an anesthesiologist. I worked in the intensive care unit for 14 to 15 years. The event I'm going to tell happened in 2014 when I was working in the intensive care unit in a private hospital in Izmir. We had a patient who was from Diyarbakir. Her name was Sabiha F. She was in the hospital because of the CRF and CHF diagnoses. She was 74 years old. Since there was no room in the general intensive care unit, she was staying in CVC, Cardiovascular Surgery Intensive Care Department. Our CVC intensive care unit had 3 beds. I was on my night watch. My only patient was Mrs. Sabiha. The intensive care unit line rang at 2:45 a.m. The caller was the night supervisor. He told me,
Keep it. 2 women will come. Take them in. Let them visit their Aunt Sabiha.
I told him, won't the nurse complain in the morning? It is forbidden to accept visitors at this hour. He replied,
It is all on me.
However, the doorbell rang. So I went and opened the door. There were 2 women in their 20s at the door. I forgot how to speak when I saw them. They were so beautiful that I cannot describe them. I helped them to wear an apron and bonnet, but they were not speaking at all. I told them, come in, and they entered. They went right next to the patient. They were not speaking again, but it was like they were communicating with their eyes. At the same moment, the night supervisor entered and sat next to me. I was still watching them. I told the man next to me, brother, these 2 women are beautiful. One of the women looked at me and smiled. Then one of the women took something around her chest area and put it in the mouth of the patient. I suddenly stood up and yelled, "What are you doing?" Both of them started to scream, and I think they were afraid. The night supervisor got mad at me and told me,
Leave them alone.
I said, "Brother, don't you see? They stuck something in her mouth." He replied,
Don't worry.
The women left and I was curious. I went and opened the mouth of Mrs. Sabiha. I saw 3 strings of hair in her mouth. I took them out and threw them away. I asked her, "Who were they? Do you know them?" She replied,
Ew, I didn't see anyone.
I said, "Are you sure? 2 women came and were next to you a minute ago." She replied,
No, my son, no one came.
and this statement put stress on me. I called one of the nurses from another floor and I told her I will take a 10-minute break. I went out and started to smoke in front of the emergency unit entrance. Meanwhile, the night supervisor came. I told him, "Brother, you put me in trouble this night." He replied,
Hey, Beta, what are you talking about? I don't understand it.
I said, "Brother, you sent 2 women to CVC as the relatives of the patient. You told me to take them in, and then you also visited me." He said,
No. No, I didn't come and send anyone to you. What are you talking about?
I said, "Brother, you called me and said 2 women will come for a visit. Let them in." And then you came and sat next to me. He was really getting mad as I spoke. He said,
I was sleeping in the doctor's room in the emergency unit for 3 hours. What are you talking about? It doesn't make any sense.
I said, "Okay, brother, never mind," and went back. I entered the intensive care unit and sat down. I was about to get mad. Then the night supervisor came again. He told me,
Hey, Beth, what just happened? Tell me.
I told him what happened, and he told me,
Come, let's check the security cam footage.
We called security and visited the room. We checked the footage. I see myself helping someone wear the apron and even tying it. But those 2 women were not on the screen. It all looked like I'm doing everything on my own. After 5 minutes of footage, the door opens on its own. I said, "Look, here you are entering the unit, but you are invisible right now." Anyway, my shift ended in the morning, but I didn't go home. At noon, patient relatives are accepted. I waited for them, especially the relatives of Mrs. Sabiha. At noon, her relative came, and her son and his spouse. I talked to them before they enter and talked about what happened. 2 of them started to laugh and said,
This is not the first. They have tried plenty of times before, hey, Beth?
I replied, "How, brother? I don't understand." He said,
My mother has land and fields in the village. My stepmother is trying every possible way to get these lands and fields. Spells, amulets, hauntings. She has tried all the dirty work. This should be one of them. However, thank God we got rid of them all. Do not be afraid. Get used to it. I told him, "How can I get used to this? I can't deal with such things while working." We went to the chief physician with the night supervisor and explained the situation. They then transferred her to another hospital. My grandfather, Jim, died when I was 17, around 5 years ago, and his last months were rough on the whole family. He had advanced brain cancer, but he spent most of his time at home under hospice care. One afternoon, it was about 2 weeks before Jim died, I was alone with my grandpa, waiting for the hospice nurse to come and check in on him. A man who I'd never seen before, Dave, knocked on the door. He was wearing hospital scrubs, but he hadn't brought any equipment with him, which was odd. I asked him if he worked for the hospital, and he nodded. He said this was his first shift with Jim, but that he'd reviewed my grandfather's file and that he wanted to speak to whichever family member had the legal authority to pull the plug. Jim wasn't even on life support, so I guess Dave was using plug as an expression.
on my grandfather. I should say that I live in a right-to-die state where euthanasia is legal, so it's not like that option had never occurred to us. But as far as I know, no member of my family had ever expressed openness to euthanizing Jim. I told him that I had no authority to make that decision and that my grandfather, who was now delirious and unable to consent to much of anything, had specifically said to prolong his life indefinitely unless he was crying out in extreme pain, which he wasn't. Dave put his hand on my shoulder as though he were consoling me, and he talked about how old people become burdens that their families need to let go of. Then Dave pulled a bottle of pills out of his pocket and said they were barbiturates that would trigger a peaceful death. He said the coroner would determine that Jim died naturally from cancer. I started to panic, and I firmly told him that under no circumstances would we be euthanizing Jim at this time. But he started to untwist the bottle as he walked towards Jim's bed. I tried to wrestle the pills from his hand, and he seemed startled. He played innocent and said he just wanted to show the pills to Jim. Dave knew perfectly well that my grandfather had almost no idea what was going on. I called 911 and rapidly explained the situation to the dispatcher. Dave suddenly became very scared and bolted out of the house. The cops arrived within 5 minutes, and Jim's actual hospice nurse arrived a few minutes after that. Based on my physical description, the police and hospital staff were able to identify Dave as a recently fired hospital orderly. Dave was charged with making a quote-unquote criminal threat based on my testimony, but unfortunately, he was acquitted. Thanks for watching this video. If you want to support the channel, we have a link in the description. Don't forget to subscribe, comment, share, like, and press the bell to get notifications when new videos are uploaded. You can send your real or fictional stories to the email address sendmeyourstory13@gmail.com.